So we've got a really full agenda this afternoon, so I'm just going to jump in. Welcome back, everybody. As Patty said, I'm Gail Matthews, ANSY's Associate General Counsel. We are so pleased that you're all joining us to hear our second panel discuss this, what the standards community needs to know about data security regulations, practices, and standards. Jumping right in, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this panel, Matthew Travis. Matt is the first Chief Executive Officer of the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Accreditation Body, the CMMCAB. And they're going to call themselves the Cyber AB because that's a whole lot easier. And its job is it's going to be the nation's sole authorized provider of cybersecurity certification credentials for the defense industrial base. Cyber AB was chartered by the Department of Defense to work with the thousands of companies that support the DoD, particularly in the DoD's effort to implement common and verifiable cybersecurity standards. Before taking on the role of CEO of this new and demanding enterprise, Matt served as the first Deputy Director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, which is the nation's leading civilian cybersecurity agency. Prior to this position, he was the Deputy Undersecretary for National Protection within the Department of Homeland Security. He's also a former naval officer, a former White House liaison to the Secretary of the Navy, and holds a master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University. You are totally qualified for this role today. He's done a whole lot more, but we've got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming Matt Travis.
Thank you. Thank you, Gail, and thank you to ANSY for the invitation to be here, and very much appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon. So happy World Standards Day, World Standards Week. And as I was thinking about today's panel, as best I can tell, this is the 54th year that World Standards Day has been celebrated, and suffice to say, I doubt that back in 1970, there would have been a panel on data security standards and data security regulations. But actually, not too much after that, there probably might have been a need to have it. The cybersecurity community generally recognizes 1971 as kind of the start of the first computer virus, or really computer worm. A guy by the name of Bob Thomas was a computer programmer for a company called BBN Technologies up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he was working on a project on the old ARPANET dealing with packet switching technology. And so he developed, really for exercise testing purposes, a self-replicating patch of code, a computer worm. And that's kind of seen as the flag in the sand of when cybersecurity really started, again, in a testing environment. And actually, of course, related, but not too later then, it was the National Bureau of Standards first created the Computer Security Program in 1971, or 1972, I believe it was. So World Standards Day in 1970, first kind of computer worm in 71, and then by 72, the National Bureau of Standards had started to develop a standard for information security. And what a ways we have come. But NIST itself was spending a lot of time during the 70s and 80s developing various standards for data and technology. But in terms of the convergence of industry standards and governmental regulations and driven by the threat landscape, things didn't really take off until really the beginning of this century. So 20 years ago, at the World Standards Day celebration, you still might not have had a panel on data security protection. But now we do. And when you think about what has changed in terms of the threat landscape, data standards and all the various different forms of data security standards that are out there, as well as the regulatory environment that has certainly advanced quite a bit over the years, we have a much different picture to look at and certainly to talk about. I mean, just on the threat actor alone, when you think about all the different ways that protected information, whether it's personal identifiable information, intellectual property, financial data, controlled and classified information, all the different ways it can be compromised and exfiltrated, all the different attack vectors that global cyber threat actors have employed nowadays. You start with that, Bob Thomas's worm into viruses, malware, ransomware, SQL injections, zero-day exploits, DNS tunneling, DNS spoofing, cross-site scripting, man-in-the-middle attacks, insider threat attacks, spear phishing, whale phishing, password attacks, URL interpretations, brute force attacks, Trojan horses. There's a lot of different ways that bad guys are looking to compromise information networks, steal, compromise, or lock up data and jack up people's networks. And so, not surprisingly, as that threat had evolved and matured, we saw the development of a lot of not only regulations, but industry standards as well, and governmental standards. And you think about in the early part, I guess, it was in '96 that COBIT, which is a standard for kind of CIOs to adopt, came in '96. Then you had, as I'm sure Ron Ross will talk about, NIST 853 in the beginning part of '05. And before that, the credit card industry saw the need for the payment card information security PCI regime in '04. ISO 20001 in '05. High Trust '07, SOC 2 in 2010, FIPS encryption standards. You have a whole wealth now, 800-171 for COI, whole wealth of both government NIST standards, government standards, European standards, as well as commercial standards. And then the regulatory environment kind of tracked as well on that front. You could, I guess, go back and I think Alex could probably talk about it in terms of the Privacy Act of 1974 being that first regulatory initiative in terms of protecting citizens' data. But from there, the Graham-Leach Bliley Act, which protected financial data, that was in '99. And so again, in the turn of the century, we really saw between that and HIPAA and FedRAMP, FISMA in 2002, GDPR, obviously, there's just been a lot there. And so what is a CISO to do, or a CIO to do, or a company's general counsel to do? Where are we in terms of how to make sense of the threat, the standards that are available, and what the government is either compelling us, encouraging us, or requiring us to do in terms of protecting various types of data? There is actually a group that, there's more than one, but the Secure Controls Framework Council has created a master crosswalk mapping of all the various data security standards from across the globe. And if you're an Excel black belt, it'll blow your mind in just terms of how much there is there. It crosswalks all the security requirements across dozens and dozens of standards, and it makes your head explode. So that leaves us in an interesting position here in 2024 in terms of where is this going, how to make sense of what standards do I need, where are these standards going, where is the threat going, and what is the regulatory environment going to look like, especially now that we're entering into a new administration here soon. So a lot to talk about, and no better group to talk about that with than the professionals and experts that we have assembled here this afternoon. So I'm going to introduce each one, and then we'll get things started. To my immediate left, I'd like to welcome Alex Joel, who is a scholar in residence and adjunct professor at the Washington College of Law up at American University here in DC. Alex spent a good part of his career in the federal government. He was a senior officer with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He was a privacy official. He also worked in the General Counsel's Office of the CIA. And that privacy element has been another very growing subsector of the cybersecurity field over the past several years. And prior to his government service, he worked in private practice at Pillsbury and also worked for Marriott International in a privacy capacity. Sitting next to Alice is Brandon Pugh, who is the director and the resident scholar, or resident senior fellow for the R Street Institute, which is a think tank not too far from these offices. And he there is senior fellow for cybersecurity and emerging threats. He also serves in his spare time in the U.S. Army Reserve as a national security law professor for the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. He is also another fellow at the West Point Institute, Cyber Institute up at the U.S. Military Academy, which is a great group. He's served as legislative counsel for the New Jersey General Assembly. He's been president CEO of a Homeland Security Consultancy, does a lot of work in academia, as well as volunteering his time in other professional groups and associations. So Brandon, welcome. Great to have you here. Next to Brandon is Sarah Scafidi. And full disclosure, Sarah and I were colleagues back in the day. So it's good to see Sarah again. She is now the managing director and security advisor at SentinelOne. SentinelOne acquired the Krebs Stamos Group, where Sarah worked before that. She has nearly 20 years of advising senior executives in the commercial sector, in the energy sector, the manufacturing sector, and elsewhere. She assists these officials, as well as government officials, in advising them on cybersecurity practices, doing implementation, as well as red teaming and exercise design for their security priorities. Sarah, great to have you with us. And next to Sarah is Justin Sherman, who is an adjunct professor at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. There he teaches cybersecurity, data privacy, and technology privacy. And he's also the founder and CEO of Global Cyber Strategies, which provides risk research and advisory services, as well as training and exercise and simulation development. He has also been very active in kind of the thought leadership and has testified before both houses of Congress and has also spoke at White House cybersecurity events. And certainly not least, and I think, Eleni, do we have Dr. Ross? He's right behind us. There we go. Okay, there we can see him. I want to welcome Dr. Ron Ross, who will be here virtually. As many of you probably know, Dr. Ross is a fellow at NIST, where his focused areas cybersecurity, system security engineering, risk management, as well as a lot of the FISMA-related activities. In CMMC, Dr. Ross is known quite well, given the 853 and the NIST 800-171 frameworks that are used there. He is a graduate of West Point and served many years in leadership and technical positions during a 20-year career in the Army, and congratulations on Army's thus far very successful football season. So hopefully that will continue. So great group here. Let's get right into it. And I'd like to start with Brandon, because when I talked on the upfront about the threat landscape, I really just talked about some of the tactics and approaches. Brandon, can you get us started on how should the standards community, how should executives in the commercial sector and even government officials think about how the threat landscape has evolved to where we are now, how to think about it, how to prioritize it, who's behind it?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Let me first say the shameless plug for ANSI itself. ANSI does a great job of advocating for you in the cybersecurity space. As an example of that, we worked pretty closely with them on the IoT label initiative at the White House. If you're not familiar, really designed to be like an Energy Star label, but for cyber. So if that interests you, by all means, connect with ANSI or I afterward, or even during Q&A. But specific to your question, honestly, this threat briefing could be an entire presentation, and often is. So maybe I'll offer maybe one threat actor I'm thinking about, one specific threat, and then perhaps one common victim. And then obviously any of the panelists here are more than qualified to elaborate any of that. So obviously the first, in terms of the specific actor, may not surprise many of you, but where I spend most of my time researching is specifically China. And I think that's going to be a focus we continue to see, especially given the changes in things in Washington, D.C., most recently around the election. In terms of their tactics, what do we see? It's a wide variety of tactics. They have some favored ones, but there's also many obscure ones that do not get as much attention. One that I frequently touch on, I'm sure others in this panel will probably want to elaborate on, is just China's quest to collect as much data as humanly possible, not just on their own citizens, but on Americans and many of our allies around the world. And my specific research has really looked at what are the consequences to the military when they're collecting us on senior intelligence officials and senior members of the military. Unfortunately, we've seen consequences like that already play out in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as what we see in Israel and Hamas. Anything from more effective disinformation to even physical violence against military members and their families, all because of this publicly available data that's either acquired or just commonly stolen. But then on the other hand, we see China using traditional means in cyber, going after a critical infrastructure. That's not just a talking point. That's unfortunately a reality. Realizing that when we say critical infrastructure, it's not just one segment. There's many different types of entities underneath that. And it's not even, some are quick to point out saying, well, we haven't seen many direct attacks at critical infrastructure. Another thing our government has actually done a really good job at is talking about just what is China's interest in pre-positioning, perhaps gaining access to critical infrastructure, not for something that's immediately visible, but perhaps in advance of a future conflict. That is a major concern. And of course, China, obviously we like to talk about China. They're not alone. We see other nation state actors also being very active in this space. I think they probably get the most attention. In terms of a specific threat, it's probably timely considering we just hosted the counter ransomware initiative in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. But ransomware is an increasing concern, notably for me, because of its ability to go after small entities. And I think that's really the concern. And you can tell ransomware has become so prolific because the other types of attacks that Matt did such a great job walking through, you may not be as familiar with them, but I'm sure ransomware is one that is now just become a buzzword that everybody has unfortunately heard talked about. The fact of the matter is, I think a lot more needs to be done. So many entities still are not prepared for this and think, well, it will not happen to me. I'm a small entity. What value do I actually have? And that's unfortunately just not the case. And then in terms of like a specific target, concerningly, to my last point, it's often the small entity. Not to say like large industry are certainly not facing their share of cyber incidents. They of course are, but it's really the small actors who perhaps have less of a security budget or are less sophisticated when it comes to security. I think they're especially vulnerable. An example of that is just how we've seen an uptick in rural hospitals being victims of attack. Or to my background, I was a state and county elected official for a long time. Even local school districts are unfortunately seeing their fair share of cyber incidents. So the point that really should be is that you're not immune if you're a K-6 school district with 100 employees, or if you're a Fortune 100 company around the world. These are unfortunately very real. So there's a lot I could say on that. Maybe I'll leave it there to see if others have anything to add, or if there's a specific area of interest for anybody in the panel, certainly can dive into that too.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Justin, you want to follow up on that and how you kind of see how to think about the threat right now?
Sure. There we go. Oh, all right, great. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about data, if that works. So Brandon just hit on this, right? We're all aware we're being watched constantly, not to sound too tinfoil hat, but we really live in an increasingly complex environment in terms of data, right? And that's both the volume and types and depth of data collected by single companies, whether that's for cybersecurity purposes, advertising, what have you, as well as the proliferation of that data. And that's where a lot of my work focuses, right? It's increasingly easier for somebody who says, well, you turned off your phone location settings, but actually we can still get it through this app. Or you may be told your phone book that you don't want your phone number to be listed, but we can go online and there are these online white pages websites that sell all this stuff for $2, right? And so this has a scale of implications, I think, that similar to what Brandon mentioned, goes from the individual all the way up to the national level. So starting really zoomed in, the fact that there's so much data out there, and again, a lot of companies are not in this business of let's post and sell your family's information online, right? That's not, most companies, but there are a lot of companies that do. And so this has created a tremendous amount of risk to individuals. There have been stalking cases for decades where people can get this information online. There have been threats to government workers, actually for different reasons, but across multiple party administrations, for folks who are nonpartisan civil servants. They are doing their job, and people are easily able to dox and threaten them, build watch lists and so forth about these people, because again, you can type in a name online and get that information for $5. So there's sort of the individual level concern, but back up to what Brandon mentioned, this is also why data security is so relevant for businesses and for national security, right? Because if we're worried about phishing emails, it's probably not great that we have companies out there compiling and selling lists of every employee's email address at your company, right? That facilitates the kinds of cyber risk we're talking about, increases regulatory exposure, increases the risk of a breach. And it's also a national security issue, right? The fact, and I think Alex certainly will talk more about this, the fact that as Brandon said, it's so easy to acquire data now, not just through the back door, so to speak, through hacking, but by walking through the front door. There were Russian actors, ProPublica did a story early on into the Ukraine war where they were still running advertisements through certain Google Analytics plugins and pulling out data on people in different countries through those systems. There have been reports recently of other foreign governments, Iran and others, posting information online about US government employees in an attempt, not high-level people, like lower-level public servants doing their job, to specifically intimidate them into not working on a certain policy area, let's say. So at every level, it kind of is an issue. So all to say, I think as you both highlighted, as we think about what are good standards to protect networks, to protect devices, and so on, data is part of that. It's also in some ways its own animal of making sure that this data supply chain is as secure as we can make it.
Thanks for that. Sarah, so the threat's not going away. I think Justin and Brandon have established that. Your clients obviously are thinking about it because they're hiring you to help them, but are they hiring you to help them because that's just what their board is telling them to do? Or is there an appreciation for the risk that is resident within their networks? Or how do they see it? What's your observation on your clients that you work with?
Yes, certainly. I mean, look, with digital transformation rapidly accelerating over the last decade, the risks really are stacking up, right? Boards are actively, they're aware of these items. They're seeing all of the stories that we all read in the news. As one gentleman, excuse me, Brandon just mentioned recently, ransomware. You can't miss it these days, right? And so they're actively engaging their executive teams on wanting to know, how are we managing this risk? What are our governance structures around to manage this? And there's definitively, reasons why they're asking these questions. I mean, look, as Brendan was just referencing, authoritarian governments are actively pursuing their economic and security goals, right? Corporations are facing very active, capable threat actors. Corporations also have infrastructure, operations, and people in risky areas globally. And so, not to mention the technology, which is changing rapidly, and we're oftentimes very quick to adapt, as well as just even our global supply chains, incredibly complicated and all very data rich, right? And so, as Justin was just mentioning as well, all these things are very, very appealing to threat actors. And so today's technology and cyber leaders are really finding themselves increasingly responsible for managing some of these coupled cyber regulatory operational risks, and as a result have a seat at the table to really help the business understand and achieve their objectives, but also doing that in a very risk-informed decision way.
Thank you. So Dr. Ross, the threat's there. There's an increasing awareness that we need to do something. One of the nice things about standards is they give us something to either aspire to or to go ahead and adopt. If you could talk us through how NIST has viewed its role in encouraging and pushing not only industry, but government, obviously, in terms of data security and protecting information networks.
Well, I think the first thing to look at is what drives a lot of our work is the recognition about how the landscape has changed over the last decade or two. We're talking about incredibly innovative, complex technologies being developed by our private sector. We're all customers of that technology. And I think the thing that is so striking, what makes this problem so difficult and challenging, is our incredible dependence on that technology for everything we do. Everything comes down to we're pushing computers driven by software and firmware into everything that matters. There's been a massive convergence of cyber and physical systems, looking at the number of computers in your automobile that control not just your entertainment system, but the critical braking system. Everything from pacemakers in your chest to power plants, that technology is deeply embedded in all of our systems, including the data. And it goes deep into the critical infrastructure, and every country around the world is experiencing that same type of dependence. So what do you do in that situation? So at NIST, we're looking at this landscape and we're saying, okay, we need to be able to focus on the kinds of security standards that not just protect data, but that data is in process and storage and transmission within that computer system. And everything is connected ubiquitously across the globe now. So in some sense, there's a shared sense of risk now because of this connectivity and our total dependence. So we need security standards that address the security functions that protect the safeguards that you're implementing to protect the data in the systems. But there's another huge problem now with regard to security assurance. And these are two sides of the same coin. You talk about multi-factor authentication or encryption. Those are security technologies that can be employed in commercial products, and they're implemented within a system that help protect the data. But the assurance aspect goes to something much deeper. How much do we trust those functions to do what they're supposed to do and the system to perform its mission, whatever it's supposed to carry out? How much trust do we put in that it's going to perform under stress or when needed? This could be a problem in a weapon system or when NASA is sending a spacecraft into orbit. It could be a power plant issue. You mentioned the fact that adversaries now can attack a system directly, or they can pre-position malicious code and trigger that code at a time of their choosing. So this is both a national security problem and an economic security problem at the same time. So that's what is really driving how NIST is looking at the standards work. A lot of the work we do is driven by some legislation that comes out. You mentioned FISMA earlier. That gave us specific standards and guidelines to develop as part of our responsibilities as NIST in the Department of Commerce. But we're also always looking at our customers and seeing what their needs are. And of course, the standards community plays a very big role in that, whether it's ANSI, we develop a lot of standards that are applicable just to the federal agencies, but are then adopted on a voluntary basis. You mentioned 853 and some of the control catalogs that we produced over time. And those standards are adopted voluntarily by state and local governments, tribal governments, and the private sector. I guess what I would say is that when you look at this from a public and private sector perspective, we're all in the same boat today. We're all using this great innovative technology that's changing the way we do business. It's changing the way we look at privacy. And the fact that we are so dependent on the technology makes this a shared problem for the public and the private sector. The adversaries really don't distinguish. They don't really care if you're a Fortune 500 company or a small mom and pop organization. The data still has value, and they're going to go after it. And the last thing I would say is that we don't just look at things from a threat perspective of cyber attacks. We've got a publication that talks about really 4 different types of threats to data and systems. And that would be, of course, the cyber attacks is the one that gets all the attention, but you also have errors of omission and commission. This would be good guys who do inappropriate things. And we've seen several situations just in the past several months of how a single error by someone in the development process with pushing that software out to hundreds and thousands of customers almost in real time can have a huge impact around the globe. And then, of course, you have physical failures of a technology. A server goes down, things that physically fail. And then, of course, we have natural disasters, hurricanes in Florida, fires in California. So the threat landscape to our systems and our data are really multifaceted. And that's where we're looking at developing new strategies, new approaches, so we can actually help our customers defend their systems in environments of high stress, cyber threats, and as well as other types of hostile environments they may be working within.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dr. Ross. It's not just about data security, right? It's resiliency of the networks. It's the accessibility, the redundancy, that these standards all help drive improvement over all those fronts. You also mentioned privacy. So Alex, you've spent a lot of time in what is a very active and has been a very perplexing subsector of the data security world in terms of privacy. Can you just give us an overview of the drivers within the privacy community, but both legal and otherwise?
So I think my brain is exploding because everything is coming together, and everything seems to me to be more interconnected than it ever was. And the same can be said for privacy, right? So it used to be, and I've been doing this for a long time, we used to always say you can't have good privacy without good security, right? Obviously, you need to secure personal information so that that personal information can be kept private and used for authorized purposes, not used to harm people. But now I think the reverse is very, very true. And you're seeing the reverse play itself out in terms of national security protective measures the government is taking these days, which is you can't have good cybersecurity if you don't have good privacy. And cybersecurity professionals ought to be demanding that there be enhanced privacy protections, because personal information is a vector to get into systems and to undermine both corporate security and national security. And increasingly, those things are also becoming so interrelated. One of the things that I tell my students about is that it used to be the government felt if it was taking a national security activity, it was acting directly, like it was putting troops on the ground. It was literally, putting a listening device on somebody's phone. It was itself taking these actions. And these days, the government isn't putting tracking devices on people. We all carry tracking devices in our pocket, right? So this is an amazing explosion of personal information. And so now when the government wants to act either to protect national security or to carry out surveillance, it acts through companies, through the private sector. So the private sector is the new, not to be overly dramatic here, but it's the new battleground where nation states are maneuvering with and against each other for advantage. And so you see this play itself out. We talked about personal information. I think that we need to protect personal information as a national security priority. And I think the government currently agrees. And so we've seen several measures come out from the government that limit how personal information is going to be made available to adversarial nations such as China. We've talked about China, but it also includes Russia, at least currently. And so this is in an executive order. It's in a statute that was passed by Congress, where you are seeing limits being placed on how personal information can flow to countries that could use that personal information in ways to undermine our security. And I think amplifying all of that, like amping it up even further, is artificial intelligence. The tech is moving so quickly that I don't think we as human beings are able to keep up with all of its implications. But one of the key weaknesses of any security system is all of us, right? As individuals, are human beings. We can be fooled. And the AI is getting so good that it is going to superpower the efforts of bad actors, including nation-state adversaries, to fool us, to fool individuals into, for example, phishing attacks, which are going to be much more effective, much better targeted, use much more personal information about each one of us in order to get us to trust something that we see in our normal course of business, and to let some threat into the systems where previously maybe that just wasn't it was easy to sort of tell when an email was fake, it's that the English isn't good, the grammar isn't good. Well, the grammar is great these days, right? I know that from teaching at the law school. Like you sort of start seeing when all of a sudden a writer who was maybe struggling a bit starts submitting these amazing well-written essays, and I'm thinking, well, I should be using ChatGPT myself a little more with my work. So I feel like one of the things that I always have felt is that technology moves exponentially and unpredictably. Policy moves much more slowly and much more incrementally, but human nature is the same. And so when you've got, human nature being who we are, given enormously powerful tools that can have an effect worldwide, and the policy community and maybe some of the standards community, right, is necessarily moving more slowly and more incrementally, we have this large space where actors can act. And I guess I'll just end on the privacy thing by saying, I think the time is, the US famously doesn't have comprehensive privacy legislation. I think the US needs to get its hands around the value that personal data can have in the right hands, of course, but also the risk it poses if it's in the wrong hands. And we need a standard in this country for how we're going to be thinking about protecting personal information if we're going to have good security.
Yeah, I remember after the OMB breach some years back, getting questions from some of my non-cyber friends, like, why would anyone want to, compromise and exfiltrate OMB data? Same thing with the Marriott breach, and China didn't hack into Marriott to steal the rewards points. There's value in names and addresses and phone numbers, not only for China, which is trying to build a global Big Brother database that would make Orwell look like the minor leagues, But also, Justin, the whole idea of data brokers, there's a commercial value to this type of data. So let me toss it over to you to talk a bit about that. And I just encourage all the panelists, feel free to jump in any time. We'll kind of go to a free-flowing conversation from here.
Yeah, and others can interrupt me if I start rambling, which I often do on this issue. So yeah, so data brokers, as you mentioned, it's interesting, right? There are, as I said, right, every company right now uses data. I mean, that's pretty obvious. As we said, lots of companies use that for different reasons, but in particular, how they share it really varies, right? So for most companies, that's using it internally, that's sharing it with vendors for product development, research, cyber threat, fraud detection, whatever, right? There's a whole industry of these data brokers. There are thousands in the US, and the business model is not, what product are we giving you? The business model is we're going to sell data, literally. And so, we've done studies where, you can buy spreadsheets on people's names and the mental health prescriptions they take and what dosage and which brand and how often, or take your pick of, military service members' financial information. So, like you're saying, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because as Alex just noted, this is another area where the private sector, again, a piece of the private sector, but is doing activities that are not only incredibly harmful for our privacy as people, but also create interesting and complex national security risks, right? Because if the business model is to sell the data as much as possible to make more money, well, then doesn't that introduce the risk that a China, Russia, Iran, or so forth is equally interested in all of that data? But the second piece I think that this is so interesting is, as you said, it speaks to the commercial demand for more and more information. And we've already loaded up with acronyms. I don't know how many more buzzwords we want to do, but Alex did rightfully mention AI and machine learning, right? And there is already a massive, massive increase in demand for commercial data and personal data from all kinds of companies to build those systems. I have watched as companies, for example, we can name and shame, I don't know, but a large online stock photo seller that previously had no interest in getting rid of their own pictures, now signing multi-million-dollar contracts to give all of those photos to people who want to train AI, right? So like it's creating interesting commercial dynamics that, as we're all saying here, also then spill out into the space of what are those standards? What are those standards for sharing, for selling, right? What are the standards for what it's used for? If I said, yeah, it's fine to sell that credit data to prevent fraud, and now that's being sold for some sort of AI targeting ad thing, like, well, that's pretty different. So what are the standards around that? And then second, I think just back to this larger picture that I think Sarah put it well, of the efforts to influence companies from all kinds of governments, including autocratic governments, likewise means we have to look at where our biggest points of exposure are. And companies that hand out data willy-nilly because that's the business model, that's a pretty serious area of concern.
Interesting. Brett?
Yeah, two quick follow-up points. One on data brokers. Oh, went off. Try again. Okay. Two quick follow-ups. One on data brokers specifically and one on AI. On data brokers, I really do agree with Justin on the need for some sort of standard, some sort of guidance at the very least around data brokers. Because, I do think there are very bad data brokers, to put it bluntly, like some that operate in the shadows. You're not even sure if they are in fact data brokers. Many actually hide that. However, there are valid uses as well. The United States government publicly acknowledges that they leverage data brokers. There are valid purposes for data brokers in law enforcement context. We've seen success stories where victims of human trafficking and sexual assault and sexual trafficking are found because data brokers. I say that, but there are many cases where the opposite is happening. So there are good actors in the space, but there are many bad ones too. So just kind of like fine-tuning it, and that's hard because how do you take a policy solution? Because on one angle, you could outright ban and shut down the entire business model, but does that have implications to the United States government and the intelligence community? Just things to think about. I have my own thoughts, but happy to get them in Q&A. On AI, I'm actually an optimist with the technology, and I think not to tee up Ron for a response, but I actually think NIST has done a great job. I think they've done a really good job of looking at AI and leveraging their existing frameworks in cyber and privacy and applying it to AI, as well as giving guidance to those entities that may not be as sophisticated. And I think a good application of this is bad actors are going to misuse the technology, whether they're misusing AI itself or going after the infrastructure of AI, regardless of what we do from a policy or regulatory standpoint. It's just going to happen. I like to see, though, like, where can we as positive people in the space better utilize the technology to prevent these malicious activities. I think for one, it actually can give defenders an advantage. Perhaps that will change over time, but AI has been leveraged in the security space for well over a decade. AI is not new to, and I'm sure everybody in the space knows that, contrary to the rise of generative AI, but it's helped in security now for many years. I'm actually encouraged what we've seen because of generative AI really put a lot of AI companies, on the offensive and continue to develop their products into perhaps applications we may not have seen for several more years. A good example of that, I just think, is the ability to automate responses to different incidents. It's super neat to see how that's evolving.
Dr. Ross, Alex has teed up the need for a global or a national privacy standard. Brandon and Justin have mentioned AI. How does NIST look at both of those emerging areas?
Well, I think we've already made our contribution. We've been working on privacy as part of our standards and guidelines for the past decade or more. In fact, many of you may know that in one of our revisions to 853, that started out as a security catalog way back when FISMA first started. And over time, we worked with the privacy officers in the federal government, and then we formalized that in one of the more recent updates. And now that catalog is fully security and privacy control. So we brought privacy into the conversation. So it's a fully equal partner with security. And I think that's an important contribution. Now, whether it goes to those guidelines are called out in legislation or a policy or an executive order, that's kind of outside of our lane at NIST. But I just wanted to circle back on one thing. Matt, you mentioned the OPM breach, and I'm not sure everybody is aware of how bad that breach really was. I know you were part of that breach. Some of the other panelists might have been. I was part of it. What the adversary was after in that case was there's a form that gets filled out when you get a security clearance. It's called the SF-86 information. So when you're applying for a security clearance, and of course I have a top secret clearance, so they ask you lots of questions. They go through a complete background investigation. They even polygraph you sometimes. All of that data was exfiltrated by the adversary, so it's not just having credit card information. It's having everything about your family. They know everything about my wife, my 2 kids, everything. And that is the seeds of espionage, and that's how the game is played. So these have really serious implications, things that look like just an ordinary cyber attack and have really far-reaching implications. With regard to artificial intelligence, it's actually been around, I think, 50 years or more now. It just came onto the radar en masse recently, and NIST has done a great job on their AI risk management framework. But there's a lot of this goes back to, we talked about earlier, about protecting data and systems. Artificial intelligence, no matter how it's used, whether it's about helping you defend your systems or generating term papers for students, it's still an application that runs within a system writ large. And if you're not ready, willing, and able to protect that system across the entire stack, from the application to the middleware to the operating system to the integrated circuits out to the supply chain, the adversary is going to find the lowest point in that stack where they can compromise that system. They may try to compromise the software. And again, AI applications are just software applications. If you can compromise those applications as an adversary, you can absolutely control the output from that AI program. So you're giving people information that may in fact be misleading. And so this gets back to the whole discussion of the kind of world that we built with complexity, complex systems, complex hardware and software all coming together to give us tremendous capability, but yet we have the black box problem. All of this, the black box is a metaphor I use for your smartphone, your tablet, your desktop computer, your laptop, or even a supercomputer. We use the technology, we use the systems, but we're only there up to the user interface. We have no idea what's going on inside that black box, all that complexity. And if we can't get better assurance on what's actually going, how were those programs developed? Secure coding techniques, memory safe programming languages, all the things that we talk about give us greater trust in those critical applications and systems that we're using. And if we can't get that trustworthiness, then we're really going to be flying blind throughout the critical infrastructure and even into your home computer system. So it's the issue of our time. And I think the standards world is going to play a very important role in how we come to grips with all these really difficult and challenging problems.
Hey, Sarah, when your clients think about protecting data, are they thinking about privacy data, PII? Are they thinking about, or are they just really worried about their own intellectual property or financial data? Do you see a growing awareness or acknowledgement that their employees' information is something of value that they need to protect?
Yes, certainly. Not only their customers' information, and their IP, but also, yes, their employees' data as well. You know, many are, of course, aligning to a variety of NIST standards. NIST 800, CSF, ISO standards as they relate to their particular industries. But they're really looking to and engaging their partners and their various consultants to help them figure out how to apply those in a way that makes the most sense for their organization and for their operating model. So for example, whether it's something as, we all hear about zero trust, right? It's a bit of a buzzword, but also it's something that there are some implementation guidelines out there, but like, how do you actually apply that to an organization that may not actually fit exactly? And so engaging with folks to help them understand, how do we sort of take the unique operating model that these organizations have, leverage the frameworks and standards that are already existing, and then sort of create a really bespoke sort of security and trust type set of guidelines that really align and align to the backbone of NIST CSF, then they can then ultimately develop the practices that they need to support to identify the trust that they have and share that, communicate that effectively, both with government partners and other.
So you see a demand signal for standards within the commercial sector. They're not just taking the advice of what their vendor tells them to do. They're looking for.
Yeah, they are. And then and also just to give a shout to the AI framework too, like their organizations are actively we're seeing rapid business adoption, right, in AI, and that's great, but it needs to be done responsibly. And so having an opportunity to to brief the boards and C-suites on exactly what these risks are, regulatory and compliance being one of them, like what types of regulatory data is potentially going to be in these models, what can and can't be. But then also on a more tactical level, as they're thinking about developing and designing their own models, whether it's build or buy, thinking about a framework that can that basically aligns to the AI aligns to the AI framework, but also align to the AI framework, but that also addresses some of their existing risk management pieces that they have in place, like SDL, Secure Development Lifecycle, DevSecOps, MLOps, these other things. And it gives them a framework in which they can then take at the ideation phase when they're getting ready to develop or ideate on a particular model that they want to use internally or put to the customers. They can then run through this risk assessment to determine whether or not it's something that they are willing to take on based on these particular these ideas or their existing risk management frameworks.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. Hello? It's like blank. Hello? Hello. All right, I'll use yours. Okay. Old school, lean in.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
We like each other up here.
So something you said struck a chord with me in terms of you were talking about security and trust and the need for companies to figure out how to adopt standards that essentially I think are cutting across organizational boundaries. And I don't know, I'm not sure that's what you meant, but this is just something that resonates with me. For example, for many years, I've been a member of the International Association of Privacy Professionals. Well, just earlier this year, they announced that they were going to be called IAPP. They dropped privacy, not because privacy is not important, but because their members, which are primarily corporate members, are experiencing the needs around data to involve more than traditional privacy, that it involves security, it involves safety, it involves trust. And and they've published a report on digital governance in companies and organizations where they see that there's so many demands on companies these days because of technology that cut across traditional organizational silos, and figuring out how within a company to deal with all of these multiple concerns. Like safety is now a big buzzword, right? Safety. Is this model safe? What does that mean? Who's responsible for safety? Who's responsible? What's the role of the privacy officer? What's the role of the CISO? How do all of these different disciplines, what are the lawyers, how well are they up to speed on all of this stuff? So I see that like this is all coming together, and something that Ron mentioned about worrying about the entire vertical chain as well as this horizontal is also so important. Like, what is your supply chain? And in terms of thinking about regulatory action from the government, some of it's going to include the need for more concern around IoT devices. Like we already have from the Department of Commerce an NPRM on connected vehicles and on using Chinese technology in connected vehicles. Why? Because two things. One is that it could introduce a security risk and a safety risk as you're using technology that might be controlled by an adversary who might do things to the vehicle, but also it's a collection platform. Our vehicles these days are collecting enormous amounts of information about us, including geolocation data. My dealer keeps calling me and they happen to know the mileage on my car, which freaked me out. And then I've gone through all of these layers of privacy notice, like where did I consent to them knowing the mileage of my car? And of course, insurance companies are now getting data from these smart vehicles, depending on how often you hit the brakes too hard, and that could affect your premiums. And so the connectivity of all of this stuff and the complexity of these issues, I think, puts some strain around traditional ideas of how you govern the use of these technologies in your companies.
So you mentioned that with the car data, I don't think a lot of Americans don't even realize when they are giving consent for the use of their data through you're clicking the cookies box on your screen. Justin, Brandon, do you want to talk through about that? Are there any emerging discussions on how to better protect the U.S. citizen from inadvertently or unknowingly giving up their own privacy rights or rights to their data?
Yeah, I'll offer something that's not truly novel. Alex alluded to it already. For anybody that knows me, I can fit this into literally any conversation I have. It's just really the need for a privacy law in the United States, and one that is at the federal law. Because it's easy to see that as purely a consumer privacy law. But to Alex's point, it has significant security implications. And think of it for a consumer. Like, why does it actually matter to you at the end of the day? If you don't live in, depending on how you want to count them, one of the 18 to 20 states with privacy laws, let's say 19 for the sake of argument, you largely don't have a lot of say in terms of who is collecting your data, how it's secured, who it's sold to, having rights around it. Like it sounds crazy. And yes, some companies voluntarily give you those rights because they operate in a jurisdiction that has them and perhaps they want to follow the strictest standards, but they don't have to. And I think that's really the challenge is how many of you have actually read all these privacy notices and are actually understanding what they are. They've went from being several pages now to long. I read one yesterday that was 71 pages. Like, who reads that? Nobody does. That's the importance of actually having a framework that makes this across the board and put the consumer in the driver's seat for their privacy. That way you don't have to rely on reading something that's buried on page 50 that says, yes, they are sending your data back to your car dealer. It's not realistic. So what can you do? And this is somewhat controversial, especially in light of AI, is data minimization as a concept. So essentially, this is, for anybody that's an expert in this, bear with me just giving us a very general explanation. Limiting the amount of data you're collecting in the first place. Or you could take it a step further and limiting it to specific categories of data. And Alex, or I think it was Alex or Matthew alluded to the federal privacy law that is, or a bill currently, that's how it approaches data. Basically, there are 17 categories. If it doesn't fall into one of those 17 categories, you can't collect data. The security benefit is you're minimizing the amount of sensitive data that's collected in the first place. And unfortunately, it's not even like you actually need that data collection. Yes, maybe there are some cases where you do. Sometimes it's just purely over collection. Think of the number of times somebody asks you for your social security number when they actually don't need it. It just comes down to being a matter of convenience for them to identify you. That's where I think moving. The con to that is it is a delicate balance because sometimes it can be hard to enumerate specific categories of collection. and and also contemplate a future need for that data. And I think that's where there can be a role for whether it be NIST or a federal agency to lend and rely on their expertise and perhaps iterate as time goes on. That way we don't pass a law today that is perhaps outdated in 6 months. And AI is a good example of that. If we were to pass an AI bill 2 years ago when someone wanted us to, likely it would have been out of date. And we're already seeing that unfortunately play out with the EU AI Act.
Well, let's go ahead and get into the regulatory aspect of this discussion. And, Dr. Ross, I think you, in one of the prep sessions, you talked about the weaponization of standards in terms of standards are great. And at a certain point in time, there might be a government agency that wants to mandate the use of that standard. CMMC is a great example, which is the conformity regime for defense contractors. In short, defense contractors have had a requirement to implement the NIST 800-171 standard as a term and condition of their contract. Over time, DoD realized that they weren't doing that. They were just treating it as any other small print on the back of the contract and not doing it. So then DoD said, well, why don't we're going to force you to self-assess your score yourself on the implementation of NIST 800-171 and enter that into a government portal so we can at least see how you're doing. There's no ramifications for a low score or high score. We just want to make sure that you're doing it. And then they realized that companies were just lying. Not all, but enough companies were just, as we say in the Navy, gun decking their data and just putting in a score that wasn't accurate, which is what brought about CMMC. And we get into the third-party validation of a standard. Dr. Ross, from your perch at NIST, can you talk about some of the discussions or maybe just observations you've had in terms of, again, I think your phrase, the weaponization of standards? Is CMMC a one-off, or is this just the kind of the tip of a broader movement that will look to third-party validation to ensure standards adoption?
Well, this is actually not a new problem. I'm old enough to remember the old days of the Orange Book and the criteria that the DoD had way back in the 1980s. And then we evolved to the common criteria, the ISO, I think it's 15408, which is a common criteria that deals with security functionality and security assurance that I talked about earlier. So at NIST, our primary job is to develop the technical standards and guidelines for the federal government. And as I said before, they're used voluntarily by state and local tribal governments and the private sector. But on occasion, those standards and guidelines, I use the term weaponization just to distinguish the fact that the vast majority of NIST guidelines, like NIST 853, are really not, they're mandatory from the sense of an OMB policy, which calls out specific publications for the federal government. But in the case of controlled unclassified information, where you have the exact same information that the federal government is processing, storing, and transmitting under that executive order that came out in 2010, we developed our own internal protection requirements for the information largely from 853. And that is how the federal government, that was how they were held to those protection requirements when the information is internal, when it's on our side. But what happens when that same information, CUI, goes over the fence to a non-federal organization? This is the DoD situation with the CMMC program that you're talking about. The information has the same value, only now it's in a non-federal organization. So in the federal government, the responsibilities of any head of agency is when they manage risk, they have to make sure that that information is protected no matter where it goes or where it is. So it's a little easier on our side because you've got that direct authority. But when it goes over the fence, we needed to have something that the feds could use to put out to the non-federal organizations that would restate or reinforce those same safeguards and countermeasures. And that's what you see with the 800-171. So in some sense, a NIST 800-171 does not really become mandatory for a non-federal organization until it has the force of a regulation, or there's some kind of something that really makes that guidance document mandatory for whatever organization we're talking about. So that's how the 171 came about. And again, to reinforce, the whole CMMC program is really about assurance. You talked about independent third party, the 3 CPAOs. There's a whole, when you talk about assurance, we've got all the requirements that are in the NIST publication in SP 800-171. And as you said, they go out to the organizations in the DoD Defense Industrial Base, and then either the companies, they either implement those, either all or none or part, And then you have the real problem of, well, how good a job did they do? How do we know? It's again, we're back to that trust issue. And how much assurance do I have that the private sector is actually protecting the information that I deem valuable under the CUI banner, so to speak? And so there's the assessment or the assurance can be anything from a self-assessment, where you grade your own paper basically, all the way to a government entity showing up at your doorstep and doing an independent third-party evaluation from a government perspective. And then, of course, there's that middle ground where you have a private sector independent organization coming in and doing that assessment of the organization who's trying to implement those requirements under the SB 800 and 171. So this is not a small issue, because assurance is not free. It takes effort to do testing and evaluation and assessments. And the real question becomes, how much do I need to trust the entity that's implementing those requirements versus how much it's going to cost, not just the government, but the private sector organization who has to go through those assessments. And so this is a very big issue today, not just because of CMMC, but if you roll the clock back 2 or 3 decades, we had the same problem with the Trusted Product Evaluation Program coming out of the Orange Book in the late 80s, early 90s. In those days, industry developed trusted operating systems that went through formal evaluations. They were not cheap, but the cost of the individual evaluation of that one product, for example, a commercial operating system, that cost got amortized over hundreds and thousands of instances where that operating system was going to be used in the public and private sector. But that program died, not so happy death. And so now we're left with the same problem 30 years later. We have great technology going out everywhere. And the question becomes, how much do we need to trust it? How much do we trust it? And what's it going to cost us to get that assurance? So that's kind of the weaponization story. And I guess I'll stop there.
No, that's, you mentioned the trust factor. And when I was at CISA, we had one regulatory authority, which is actually a physical one over the chemical sector, to make sure that chemical plants had fences and security cameras. Now CISA has regulatory authority on the cyber side, the CIRCIA Act, which is the Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, which requires owners and operators to now actively report compromises to CISA, which, again, the focus largely had been on the capacity building and trying to build cybersecurity resilience throughout critical infrastructure. So I'd ask all the panelists here in the room just to give thoughts on how you see the regulatory environment writ large evolving. Will we continue to have more mandated data security regimes, not fewer? Just go down the road, just share any initial thoughts you might have on where we are from a regulatory perspective right now. I'll start with Alex.
Hello? Should have pushed it.
Now I broke mine.
Now I broke yours too. Jeez. All right. Sorry about that. I am clearly a jinx. I guess one thing I mean, who knows, right? Because we have a new administration and we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the specific initiatives and priorities of the new administration. I will say that to the extent that regulations create burdens on industry and make things move more slowly, I think there's a school of thought that maybe we'll see less of that going forward. And along those lines, I would just point out that the U.S. is part of a larger global ecosystem, and that all the different parts that we're talking about with different aspects to technology, different flows of personal data, it's a global phenomenon. It's not just the U.S. The U.S. has a lead, certainly in certain areas, but there's a saying that I'm sure maybe some people here have heard, is that the U.S. innovates and the EU regulates. And the European Union is quite an experienced expert in regulating on cybersecurity, regulating on data protection, on artificial intelligence, on non-personal data. There have been a whole series of regulations coming out of the European Union which impact many US companies which do a lot of business in Europe. And this is a lot of what I do now at American University, studying data flows and the impact that these regulations have. as countries erect them. And at the same time, from a US perspective, we've been focusing our new regulatory activity on countries of concern, on foreign adversaries. So the US tends to be more, what moves us from a policy perspective, just my observation, appears to be national security as a call to action. And then you'll see the levers of national power get pulled. And so that's what we've been seeing more recently with actions to protect Americans' data from being exploited by foreign adversaries. In Europe, the focus tends to be more on data, personal data, more broadly, and I'm making sure that that data is used in a responsible way. And US tech companies tend to be the focus of EU regulatory efforts. So I see EU continuing to regulate, US American companies being in a global setting, having to respond to that. I think that companies, certainly the big companies, have been behind a desire for more standardized rules around the world in terms of how they deal with security issues and how they deal with privacy issues. They would like there to be one set of rules. At least that's what publicly they've been saying. And so we'll see. I can't predict the future, but I would see a trend. And again, the trend that I see in the US is to protect against adversarial regimes. That's more of a national security justification at the macro level. And also part of that is to make sure that that the US remains a leader in technology. The US articulation of this threat is twofold. Right? One is adversaries could use personal data in specific targeted ways. And the other is they could use their access to this data to superpower and continue to fuel their quest for leadership, in particular artificial intelligence. And so there's a lot of emphasis in US national security circles about whether or not China is going to take the lead in different areas of technology, be it communications technology, artificial intelligence, and sort of become the global standard for that. And that would be harmful to the US national security. So I see that going on, and I still see the EU being very active in regulations in this entire space, including AI, in ways that will impact US companies.
Brandon, how do you see it?
I'm gonna have to borrow your computer. That one doesn't work either. Okay, no, great, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm happy to give it a lot of thoughts. And if you have, I'm never shy to give predictions. Perhaps they'll turn out to be wrong around AI, cyber, and privacy. Happy to get in that Q&A. But specific to your question around predictions for regulations and where are we now? So the Biden administration, to their credit, has actually been very focused on regulatory harmonization. One I agree with. I think there's a difference in opinion, perhaps on. I would say a Republican and Democrat administration will both agree on the need to harmonize regulation based on the premise that there are many competing regulations out there pertaining to cyber. Depending on how you count them, we have well over 24 competing frameworks. And it's very likely, and some of you in this room, looking at the audience, are actually subject to several of them all at once. And the challenge is they sometimes conflict, they sometimes overlap, and they're duplicative. And that's not helpful for security practitioners or privacy practitioners spent in terms of compliance. The challenge is, though, like that, we don't have one federal law in the US. So as it's very likely one agency just adds to the problem. And I think a good example of that is to Matthew's point with CIRCIA. That was designed to be the uniform rule for incident reporting. What did we see shortly after that? The Security and Exchange Commission independently decided to make their own rule for security incident reporting. So I think that's the challenge of where we sit. So what can be done about that? The Biden administration, and this is something that was also in the Republican platform, so nothing too surprising, are both focused, Republicans specifically on standards, Biden administration more on the regulatory side, just based on what they've put out there. But how do we accomplish that? So we don't have a designated entity within the US to force all these independent regulators to come to the table. They can voluntarily, but there's nothing requiring it. There is a voluntary approach that the FCC runs where they do come, they have these conversations. But as you can imagine, many regulators do not want to cede their authority and, kind of go to another standard. So there is a bill currently sitting in the Senate that Senator Peters has introduced. We'll see if that moves before this Congress or if it comes back. Essentially, at a high level, what that would do is empower the Office of the National Cyber Director, the White House, to convene these regulators and force them to come to the table to establish a baseline and then to implement that baseline a pilot program. See if it's successful, and if so, there may be appetite coming back to Congress to actually give perhaps OECD more authority long term. All that to say is we are in a new administration and we're about to see a changeover in Congress. So if that does not pass this Congress, it's not totally clear if that will continue. But I will say, especially from a business compliance perspective, I think that'll be a message that resonates well with Republicans as something to address. To Alex's point, regulatory harmonization is very active on the international level too. I was very fortunate to be one of the U.S. representatives to a G7 convening recently, specifically on regulatory harmonization. Extreme appetite there to also make that. I think it's harder just in the US to have any type of harmonization. So I don't want to sound cynical, but getting harmonization at the G7 level or OECD actually came out recently and they've identified this is also going to be a priority area for them. Great efforts. I think it's nice. I just think it's going to be very hard to accomplish that. Okay, that was Chatham House. So I'll give you something that was said at the G7 convening. Essentially, I would say the takeaway, everybody agreed for the need to do this, but very few countries actually wanted to be the one, as you can imagine, to say, well, you follow our standards, we're not following yours. And the US had that added challenge of, even if we agree with you, who in the US actually puts us in that position to say, yes, we will follow that standard? Is it Congress or just some federal agency, or does it take the president? All open questions. So, I'll leave it there for now. I'd say it's very in flux.
Sarah, how does the private sector see?
On at the same time, but just in case you.
Okay, let's try now.
Sarah, how do you see the future? How do your clients want to see the future is another way to look at it from your perspective.
I think that work.
Only one
Magic.
Got it. Okay. It's interesting, right? Oh, sorry. A couple of my clients, based in Europe, and it's, as you already alluded to, right, regulatory regime, much different. To your point earlier, a lot of innovation over here, and so they've got it. They're in a unique position where they, of course, are sort of in a lot of ways taking a very thoughtful approach to how they're adopting AI, how they're integrating into their products and even in their business. And then also from a perspective of how they then can operate in the U.S., right? They, as particularly those who are selling products into critical infrastructure, and so they're so recognizing that they're also seeing what has played out over the last several years in terms of major breaches, SEC cases and whatnot. In one that recently didn't go forward, in particular with internal controls. And so, as much as these organizations are already being quite stringent in the way they're approaching their products, their design and such, they're also then bringing aspects or lessons learned from the U.S. in terms of even being very thoughtful and ideating on how they can create key internal control programs, right? So taking a page out of Sarbanes-Oxley, having an opportunity to think through, like, what do 3 lines of defense look like, thoughtful policies, as well as evidence of documentation and control. So a little bit of a different animal, a little spin from me here, but I would say that it's actually a good spot to be to be operating there, but then also to be able to leverage the lessons learned that we see here in the U.S.
All right, look at that. All right. Yeah, I think agree with what everyone said. I sort of, as noted, although much more diplomatically than how I will put it, there's sort of less interest now in regulation, right? Probably in the next administration. So certainly there's a lot of state privacy law activity. There's state cybersecurity and breach notification activity. There's FTC and all these others. But Alex sort of did a good strategic framing. Maybe I'll go a little bit more specific on, I do think national security, especially in the next 4 years, is going to continue to be the paradigm. So one thing that I'll point out here, which is sort of interesting, is that in the US, for the US government over the last 50 or so years, I'm actually running a book on this right now, we have a growing number of national security specific regulations and review programs that either have the effect of case by case sort of standards, best practice mitigation for cybersecurity data, et cetera, or that are all about that. So One example, if you go back 50 years, completely unrelated to this in some way, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US was stood up, right? CFIUS. And the general premise was, okay, Cold War, people are investing in the US. Are there any risks coming from this, right? And maybe, for example, we don't want a Russian company or a Soviet company at that time buying some, US steel plant that makes tanks, right? But over time, that's actually become a vector for looking at cybersecurity risk. There was stuff with the Reagan administration with semiconductors and Japanese investments. And in 2018, there was a huge expansion to this program where probably anyone in here, if anyone here has worked in venture capital or private equity, you might wince at the reference to this committee. But, lots of companies in the US that are taking investment now have to consider through this review things like, are we potentially exposing critical infrastructure data, trade secrets, and some of the stuff Sarah mentioned, personal data on US persons. So there's a bunch of these programs now. There's more and more and more of these programs. So we mentioned the Data Broker National Security Program is one. Two I'll flag that I think are going to be really relevant during the Trump administration. So the first is an authority broadly looking at the information and these acronyms, information and communications technology services supply chain. So short version, this was an executive order during the Trump administration that essentially sets up a program at the Commerce Department to look, and this is very, very broad, actually I have concerns about how broad it is, but look broadly at the tech supply chain. That could be mobile apps, that could be cloud companies, that could be antivirus software, and identify where there's a national security risk. And if there is, you can do a couple of things. You can enter into an agreement with that company to maybe say, we want more encryption, or we want more governance through a US government board of kind of how you're managing your operations. They could also expel them. So this was used for the first time this year to kick out Kaspersky, essentially the Russian antivirus company, from providing any antivirus or cyber products in the US. Now, I am on the Russian government sanctions list, so I'm a big fan of that measure. But I think the point is, right, A, this is a Trump authority. B, it was kept in place by Biden. C, the focus is going to be China. So this is going to be a really interesting thing when we think about Chinese car components, Chinese apps, Chinese, you name it, in technology. The second one, quickly, I won't go as deep into, Alex already mentioned, is the vehicle one. Also at Commerce, very early stage, hard to see how that plays out. I'm no economics expert, but certainly our friends in the EU have lots of thoughts on all of these US car manufacturing policies and restrictions and what that does to the global supply chain. So all to say, I think, as we've all highlighted, there are real national security threats in this area, and standards should and do go much broader than that, right? It's about business resilience, it's about privacy, but the US regulatory lens, I think, is going to triple down on kind of the national security issues in the next 4 years.
Well said, and very interesting. I'm going to, we have about 25 minutes for questions. So as the audience starts thinking about some questions you might want to ask, I'm going to ask Dr. Ross to give the last kind of from the seat commentary. It is World Standards Day, or at least a celebration of World Standards Day, and Dr. Ross is the standards expert. Do you want to give some concluding thoughts, maybe some things that are priorities at NIST or what you're working on as we wrap up and head into questions, Dr. Ross?
Well, this has been a great panel today, and I just want to give a hat tip to everybody out in the standards community who gets up every day and just does the hard work of creating standards. It's never easy. It takes an incredible amount of collaboration, and all of the work that the standards community is doing or will do in the future is going to be informed by discussions like we're having today. I learned a couple of things today about the one about IAPP. I didn't realize one of the P's had been taken out, but that is exactly the same problem we're having with cybersecurity in the engineering world. We've got organizations trying to build things, and cybersecurity becomes the long pole in the tent where the engineers don't speak the same language. So we've got a lot of work to do to kind of normalize all of these things we're talking about and consider security and privacy as just emergent properties that come out of an engineering process that gives us the kind of assurance we need. But this is going to be a long-term effort. And you talked about the supply chain. I believe that is an absolutely critical aspect of what's going to go on in the standards world because of the total dependency we have and the fact that there used to be a very bright line between national security and economic security. And I believe that line is totally gone today. Whether you're talking about cranes that are at our ports of entry, unloading all of these goods and services, and who makes the cranes, who controls the internal computer components that are driving those cranes. And if you're talking about that bright line going away in the age of modern warfare, where now the front line is not over in Europe and Japan anymore, it's over, we are the front line. Everything in the critical infrastructure is on the front lines because we're buying all those components worldwide. They become black boxes to us. We don't really understand what's in them. And the ability for adversaries to trigger the malicious code remotely and really do extreme damage to our critical infrastructure, which would be a military impact, because everything in the military, it's not just the front lines, it goes through that entire military supply chain, the defense industrial base that you were talking about earlier, Matt, with the CMMC program. So these are incredibly large challenges ahead of us, but I am very encouraged today to hear all the panelists and their perspectives, because we need this discussion to be clear-eyed and open and come together to come up with some good workable solutions. And that's what the standards community is going to help us do. So thanks again for letting me participate today.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Very apt comments to close out the panel part of this. So we'll open up for questions. Lenny, I don't know if there's a microphone we'll pass around, or if there are hands up, I will be happy to recognize you, but we'll open up for any questions or comments if you want to offer an opinion on anything that we've been talking about here this afternoon. Yes, sir.
This one is a comment. One of the problems in standards development is they tend to get set in silos. They don't really go for solutions to the big problem. They go for the solution to the small problem. There was a mention earlier today of PCI Security Standards Council, which I helped set up almost 20 years ago and have represented since. And the reason I'd like to tell you a little bit about them is what they do is they take an ecosystem-wide response to the problem. So we talk about frameworks, and frameworks are a good start because they tend to be a holistic approach to achieving security within a system. But PCI actually goes farther. Instead of having hardware standards from this standards organization and software standards from this standards organization and forensic standards from this standards organization, they do it all. And not only do they come up with every standard needed in order to make the, if you will, the credit and debit card supply chain secure, but then they go on to do training. Then they go on to do certification. Then they go on to do forensic testing standards. So instead of saying we create standards, what they say is we're going to solve security within this defined ecosystem end to end. And that's fairly rare in standards organizations. It doesn't tend to be done in that sort of holistic fashion. It's of course not a magic bullet, but you can see that when you're talking about this ecosystem of hundreds of thousands of merchants and intermediaries and people who handle information up and down, that they have largely solved it in some areas. The fraudsters move somewhere else, but they have had great success. Getting to data security, one of the first things they did was have the standards prevent you from taking information or storing information unless you really needed it, and then making sure that you had all of the standards in place for what your duties were when you had those standards. So one of the things, how would we solve this? Well, more broadly, one might be tighter liaison relationships between standards organizations that have a piece of the pie. It could be changing the scope of standards organizations. It could be doing what ANSI has done from time to time, putting together panels that address ecosystems so that solutions can grow out of that. Wonder whether anyone would have comments to expand on that.
I think it's a great point. I'll start off because I think the CMMC initiative has very much tried to model itself on the PCI model in terms of creating an ecosystem. It's not just about the standard. There's training, there's credentialing of consultants, there is testing, there is publishing in terms of content for the training organizations within the CMMC ecosystem. I think it's a great point because it's more than just a standard. I think what, what I would like maybe Sarah to take a stab at is that's the financial sector or the credit card subsector of the financial sector, which traditionally has been the most, the best resource. They make security for obvious reasons the highest priority. Sarah, just from a sector perspective, talk a bit about some of those sectors that are embracing of standards, either if they come from the government or they develop their own, and then some of those sectors in terms of data security that may still have a lot of work to do ahead of them. And anyone else who wants to comment on the gentleman's insight.
There you go. I'd say, look, it's the heavily regulated ones who had the time and the years to make the investments, right, to be able to manage compliance. Those are the ones where we're seeing the most maturity there. Different sectors are facing different risks. I mean, we've all talked at length here about ransomware, about cybercrime on the rise, as well as in a lot of cases, collaboration amongst those groups. But it's really what companies and organizations are wrestling with is like this intersection between geopolitics, cybersecurity, technology, and policy, right? And understanding how to operate within that context is really critical now, and having an understanding of what the threat actors are, who those threat actors are that are going after you, and the regulatory environment in which you need to operate are key. And I'd say like it's those who can put those three pieces together can make that case for at least the ones that are maybe not as heavily regulated and where the investments are not deep necessarily. Those are the ones that can make the case to further develop, cases for larger investments, I guess.
Yeah, I was thinking, when I think of critical infrastructure sectors, the water sector is one that people don't think it has this high, security risk for cyber attack, but they do, and we've seen that. And there's one where I don't know that there's a data security or infrastructure security standard for the water sector. I think there's still a lot of work to be done across, but finance, energy, obviously, as Sarah mentioned, those sectors that are heavily resourced and have a lot to protect. Brandon?
Yeah, no, Matt raises a good point. I mean, maybe just to reflect on where the Biden administration has been for 4 years, and then I'm happy to kind of go into where I think the next administration may go. And that's exactly what this administration has done, is essentially looked for sectors that have gaps. Are there sectors that do not have any degree of standard or any degree of regulation or, quite frankly, any frameworks? And there were several identified. And what they did over the past 4 years was to quickly fill that gap. Sometimes they had success, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they actually went ahead and independently made them from the White House and didn't consult with the sectors. I'm not saying that to be biased. The Deputy National Security Advisor actually alluded that was a mistake yesterday at a speech at Columbia, but they didn't replicate that mistake again, I would say. So that was the first step they did. The second one, which is still ongoing, and I do not see being done before the administration ends, is how do we start to actually harmonize them? Realizing, to Sarah's point, is some sectors do have uniqueness that you have to contemplate. So if you're saying hypothetically, we all agree to what a baseline looks like, can that, evenly apply to every sector, or do some sectors need to have something niche to their sector? And that is really the challenge, is what does that baseline look like? What sectors should you allow to deviate from that baseline and perhaps add to it? That way, that baseline is really the floor. The challenge with that is, how far do you allow a sector to go before we're back to where we are now, where there's just, yes, a baseline, but now so many deviations among different sectors? That is very much up in the air, and there's not really concrete answers to that. I will say the Office of National Cyber Director did an RFI, and there was several of you in this room I know actually submitted responses. And everybody agreed to the need to develop this baseline. The challenge is we just have not actually identified what that baseline looks like. And I think that's where there'll be disagreements between how a future administration handles this. Is this a baseline that the security practices and potentially privacy are just so fundamental that anybody really should be following? Or are they very prescriptive and very cumbersome and go to the other extreme? And that's kind of up in the air without any degree of substance, which we don't have sitting here now.
So if I could just jump in, we were talking earlier. So I mentioned a couple of times that I'm teaching now, and I'm a faculty advisor for students writing papers. And one student is writing a really interesting deep dive into the Department of Agriculture's recent rulemaking requiring RFID tags to track cattle movements as a matter of food security, among other issues. And some of the comments that the student has told me have been submitted by members of the public have raised national security concerns in terms of whether or not the data is adequately secured, given that this is critical, to U.S. national security. And so it just brings to mind, and I think the at least according to my student, I haven't verified this independently, the Department of Agriculture responded and said, "Oh, don't worry, we have the Privacy Act and we have the Freedom of Information Act, and therefore, it should be fine." And of course, those statutes are not designed to cover this kind of national security threat that the commentators were raising. So it just brings to mind that this idea of different sectors with different standards, and tying that in with the point that we've been making, that at least for the next administration, we foresee national security continuing to be something that gets raised. And your comment about geopolitics and companies having to figure out what are the geopolitics, like how do we fit into this whole thing? I hope that people are thinking national security has to be a consideration as they do this.
Other questions or comments? I see two hands up. We'll go in the back here and then over to the side next. Sir?
There you go. Okay. Sounds good. I was wondering if you could speak more about national security concerns with the surveillance and increased facial recognition technology.
So generally speaking, are you talking about threats from foreign actors, or threats or maybe our own government using it in an excessive way?
I suppose it's up to you. Yeah. I think what I'm particularly referencing is this one article I read about recently, in which a stadium that had like camera facial recognition technology in order to admit people, they were under legal trouble and they denied entrance to a member of the opposing council. And like, so things like that, whether it be corporations or foreign actors or our government.
So so the United States has repeatedly claimed that China has become the #1 exporter of surveillance technology, particularly for smart cities involving those kinds of facial recognition systems. I think it's been well documented that China deploys those systems on a massive scale within the country. So there's always the concern that by widespread deployment of both the cameras and, I have to always remind my students, those cameras have to be networked together. That data has to be all collected into one place. It's not like the local 7-Eleven and the police officer showing up there and asking to see the tape. The system has to be networked. The data has to be in one place, and then you have to have effective facial recognition. The UK has been deploying facial recognition as part of their very broad CCTV coverage in the UK. And so it can be very effective in identifying people. It's also, we have other ways of identifying who we are. So if there's a surveillance state with broad authorities, they can access cell phone data, they can access other types of data. They don't need facial recognition to do that. But yes, facial recognition does present a threat not only to privacy, because now your movements can be tracked, but also potentially could be used as a tool of authoritarian control. And if the technology is provided by a foreign state actor, could create all kinds of problems there as well. There's a very famous case in privacy circles involving Clearview AI. So Clearview is famously a company that sells the ability to law enforcement, to U.S. law enforcement agencies, they keep stressing, to they've scraped all social media, so that all available social media, so they have people's pictures along with their names pursuant to their social media profile. And if you put a picture of somebody you see on the street, that they'll do a very quick match of that person basically based on their public social media profiles. The European Union is investigating them. The UK has tried to find them. The UK Information Commissioner's Office has tried to find them to be in violation. They appealed that and succeeded so far in the UK court system. So yeah, there's a huge amount of implications around this technology. Facial recognition could be very problematic for American officers who are trying to be undercover or enter places without being detected. This is the one technology that I think Hollywood has sort of properly predicted. Some of their other technologies have not yet come to pass, but we're getting there with AI. You know, pretty soon we'll see. But when you see the Hollywood films of people's faces and then they get, you know, tagged and named, to me, the issue is not so much the facial recognition algorithms, which I think have gotten very good, but it's whether or not there's enough data, reliable data in those systems, and whether the capture technology is sufficiently well deployed to enable this centralized collection.
No, sorry. Yeah, just a quick comment on that. So one, I love that example you mentioned, right? Name and shame. It was MSG, New York City. Great example. A quick couple adds to what Alex said. So one is there's an interesting dynamic as well. He mentioned the data, and lots of companies and countries do this. China does this as well, where state-linked firms in China have provided facial recognition at discounted or no cost. These are real examples in like Zimbabwe and elsewhere. And part of the arrangement is that, okay, run your system, have fun. When you get new face data, we want it back. And so they pull it back in. So those are interesting kind of questions there. The second thing is we obviously had a pandemic where we had lots of interesting and important questions about public health and surveillance and tracking and all of that. And we've also seen that those kinds of emergency events, like with lots of other technologies, are a great way to ratchet up facial recognition. So a lot of the actual surveillance cameras in Moscow right now, for example, that run facial recognition were not there before and were put there during COVID to monitor. I mean, they have horrible COVID rates there, and that's a whole other thing, but, you know, horrible effects, but they had put those systems in place during the pandemic to monitor contact tracing, allegedly. It was part of it, and now they've stayed. So, and the last piece is just to note, I think, we've all talked today about how standards are so vital, and then also we need to think, as some of you have already mentioned, also beyond that, what's the context? And I think facial recognition, and I'm talking about our country now, is such a great example because the standards are important. Things like, are you accurate and precise, and are we doing measurements of how that works? But on the one hand, imagine law enforcement, as they can now with no warrants and whatever, doing this as much as they want on all of us where it's really inaccurate. Well, what's the standards only solution proposal sometimes is, well, then let's make it really accurate. Right. So again, that's not to say the standards aren't important. They are, but I love that example because that does get to what we've all been talking about of we also need to think about these themes of privacy and all of this that isn't just kind of the technocratic adjustment. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a question on my left in the back table, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. My name's Tim Klein, I'm the Standards Executive for the U.S. Department of Transportation. First, I wanted to validate the comment that the line between Homeland Security and economic security has long since been erased, and that our critical infrastructures are indeed the front lines now of our national security. We've been very involved with the Bureau of Industry and Security in their connected vehicle activities, their continuing uncrewed aviation activities. But as we're trying to balance, as you said, not being so burdensome to the daily operations of our critical infrastructures, to our freight movements, things like that, I'm going to ask the impossible question. What level do you apply this to? I mean, because some of these approaches are, shall we say, the vehicle level or the system level. Some are at the component level. One of the big discussions right now in the UAS space is, do we limit access at the vehicle level, or is it certain of the instruments in the instrumentation package? I don't know how to answer that, but this is something we struggle with every day. And now I'll ask one other question, because this is also our responsibilities. We're responsible for civil uses of position, navigation, and timing in the United States. That is not itself a critical infrastructure, but it is an enabling technology for all but one of the critical infrastructure sectors. Is that the place we need to be really, is that a place we need to be applying these kind of baseline rules to support all the critical infrastructures in at least that that input to the cybersecurity question. Thank you.
I'll invite any panelists who want to field that one. I will say, just from my days at CISA, PNT was a very, very area of concern in terms of the vulnerability and resiliency of PNT and the impact on, as you've mentioned, almost every sector. So I think that is still an issue of great interest within the government. Who would else like to maybe comment on the questions?
Well, now that I'm in academia, I can comment on any question. I don't know the answer to your question. I think it's an excellent question. But it did bring to mind the point that others have been making and that I also made is that this is all connected. And whatever the process is, and I love the example of where the standard setting community in the credit card area was being, looking at this as an ecosystem. We are operating in an interconnected ecosystem. And I think one difficult thing for government agencies in particular is that we are very rigidly siloed, and we have very specific areas of expertise, areas of authority, and traditionally government agencies have not been great at horizontal collaboration. I mean, it tends to work better at the working level than it does at the headquarters level, but we compete for budget, we compete for authority, we compete for airtime, we compete for time with leadership, and we have to find ways to have this horizontal collaboration if we're going to succeed with the new challenges.
Hey, Matt, could I jump in 1 second? I think that's probably the most important question of the day. We talked about the black box, and of course, one of the things that I didn't share yet, but I'll tell you a little bit about, we've been working with NASA and the Jet Propulsion Lab for the past couple of years on how do we do a better job at, in other words, we have compliance frameworks now, whether it's ISO 27000 or whether it's the risk management framework or the CSF. And you've got to apply that to a real world situation where organizations are building systems like NASA or DoD with weapon systems. And these systems are literally composed of hundreds and thousands of system elements, components we call those, hardware, software systems, cyber physical convergence. And the gentleman's question gets right to the heart. How much trust do you have in any one of those components? Because engineers have to live in the real world of building things. It's messy. Sometimes you got to make decisions about, I need a product. There's only one available. How much do I trust it? So this whole notion of assurance and opening up the black box and giving consumers, whether they're building a weapon system or a power plant or a pacemaker, the maximum amount of information, transparency on how that component is built and what level of assurance the developer used in building that widget. Because we're going to have to make some difficult decisions. And as you talked about earlier, this is why that line has come down between national and economic security, because we're all buying the same technology. We may tweak it a little bit, but ultimately, whether you're buying a crane for a port, and you have to understand how vulnerable is that crane to a cyber attack that could stop a military operation, or a pacemaker in a hospital or a ransomware attack, it's all the same problem. And it all goes back to greater transparency, greater visibility into the piece parts that we're buying to assemble this great, vast infrastructure of complex, powerful systems that are really changing our society and the way we're doing business, the way we live going into the future. So that was a great question. I'm glad we ended with that one.
Yeah, real quick, it's just as a call to really to everybody here is just to really lend your expertise in this process. I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but members of Congress are not generally the experts on these areas. Perhaps they have staffers that are really up to speed, and there are exceptions. Like we have some members of Congress that have advanced degrees in AI, but largely they're not. We rely on people that are the experts here to engage in the policy process. And I know many trade associations and standard setting agencies are engaged, but hearing from individual experts too is helpful. I know you have a million things on your plate, so that's the last thing you're thinking of, but do truly recommend, if there is something that you feel to be particularly impactful, to either engage with a member of Congress or to at very least write a response. It does not have to be a formal response like to some of you've seen for requests for information. If you write a page, I'm sure they'd be thrilled if it has something novel that is in that response. So that would just be my call for everybody in the room.
And we will have to end it there. I know I've gleaned a tremendous amount of insight from our panelists. I hope you have as well. Please join me in thanking Dr. Ross, Alex, Brandon, Sarah, and Justin for great insights and very, very well thought through panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.